September 15, 1944. Dawn was breaking over the Wewak River in New Guinea, and Japanese commanders were confident their defensive position was impregnable. The river, swollen by recent rains to over 200 yards wide with currents strong enough to sweep away a man in full gear, formed what they believed to be an impassable natural barrier. Behind this aquatic fortress, approximately 8,000 Imperial Japanese Army troops had dug into positions that had taken months to fortify. They had artillery, machine gun nests, interconnected bunkers, and most importantly, they had geography on their side. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What those defenders watching the opposite riverbank that morning did not know was that American forces were about to deploy a weapon that would render their entire defensive strategy obsolete. Within hours, vehicles that could swim would emerge from the jungle, cross the river at speeds no boat could match, and deliver troops and supplies directly onto beaches the Japanese had deemed unreachable without massive casualties. The Japanese defenders would watch in disbelief as trucks drove into the water and kept going, their wheels spinning in river current as if it were merely another road. This was not some experimental prototype or desperate improvisation. This was the DUKW, pronounced Duck, an amphibious six-wheeled truck that represented one of the most significant yet overlooked innovations of the Pacific War. In the coming hours, these vehicles would shatter Japanese defensive calculations so completely that commanders would initially refuse to believe the reports from their own soldiers. The crossing of the Wewak River would demonstrate a capability that Imperial Japanese doctrine had never anticipated, revealing a technological and tactical gap that exemplified why the Pacific War was increasingly tilting in America's favor. The situation facing Allied forces in New Guinea by September 1944 had become both promising and precarious. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign had successfully bypassed major Japanese strongholds, but this strategy created pockets of enemy resistance that still needed to be neutralized. The Wewak region represented one such pocket, a concentration of Japanese forces that, while cut off from reinforcement, remained dangerous and defiant. The geography of New Guinea had always been the Pacific theater's greatest challenge. Dense jungle-covered mountains that rose thousands of feet, rivers swelled unpredictably with tropical rains, and coastlines alternated between impassable cliffs and malarial swamps. Traditional military operations, planned for European terrain, simply did not work in this environment. Vehicles bogged down in mud, supplies rotted in humidity, and simple movements that would take hours in Europe consumed days or weeks in New Guinea. The Wewak River presented a particularly vicious obstacle. Intelligence reports indicated the river varied from 150 to 250 yards wide depending on recent rainfall. Current speeds reached 5 to 7 knots during high water, strong enough to capsize assault boats and drown heavily laden soldiers. The riverbanks on the Japanese side rose steeply in many places, creating natural killing zones where defenders could pour fire down on anyone attempting to land. Japanese engineers had spent months fortifying these advantages. Observation posts dotted the eastern bank, giving defenders clear fields of fire across the entire river width. Artillery positions had been pre-registered on likely crossing points. Machine gun bunkers, constructed from coconut logs and packed earth, covered every beach and shallow area where boats might land. The defensive plan was elegant in its simplicity. Any Allied crossing attempt would require massing boats and troops at embarkation points on the western bank. Japanese artillery would target these assembly areas. As boats entered the water, machine guns and mortars would engage them during their most vulnerable phase, the slow crossing. Survivors reaching the eastern bank would face interlocking fields of fire from prepared positions. Japanese commanders calculated that even if Americans were willing to accept catastrophic casualties, they lacked the logistical capacity to sustain repeated crossing attempts. This confidence was not mere bravado. Japanese forces had successfully defended river lines throughout the Pacific War. At the Matanikaw River on Guadalcanal, determined defenders had held against multiple American assaults. On New Britain, river crossings had cost the Allies dearly. The tactical doctrine was proven, the defensive positions were strong, and the river itself was a formidable ally. What Japanese intelligence had failed to detect was that American military logistics had undergone a revolutionary transformation. The industrial capacity that had stunned Axis forces in Europe was now being applied with full force to the Pacific. New weapons, new vehicles, and new tactical approaches were arriving in theater faster than enemy intelligence could track them. The DUKW had been developed in 1942 through an unusual collaboration between the National Defense Research Committee and private industry. The designation DUKW came from military nomenclature. D indicated the vehicle was designed in 1942, U meant it was a utility vehicle, K denoted all-wheel drive, and W signified dual rear axles. Pronouncing this alphabet soup as duck was inevitable, and the nickname stuck immediately. The vehicle was based on the standard GMC 2.5-ton truck, already the workhorse of Allied logistics. But where a standard truck stopped at the water's edge, the DUKW kept going. A watertight hull had been designed around the truck chassis, creating a vessel that could operate as both vehicle and boat. A propeller provided waterborne propulsion while the wheels remained engaged, giving the DUKW remarkable maneuverability in water. Most ingeniously, a tire inflation system allowed the driver to adjust tire pressure from the cab, enabling the vehicle to transition seamlessly from water to beach to jungle road. The DUKW measured 31 feet long, 8 feet wide, and could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo or 25 fully equipped troops. On land, it could reach 50 miles per hour on good roads. In water, it managed 6 knots, faster than most assault boats and infinitely more stable. The 6-wheel drive meant it could climb steep beaches and push through mud that would stop conventional vehicles. Early combat trials had been spectacular. During the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, DUKWs had proven their worth by swimming from ships offshore directly to beaches, unloading supplies, and returning for more loads while conventional landing craft were still shuttling back and forth. In the Pacific, DUKWs had supported landings at Saipan and Guam, demonstrating their effectiveness in coral reef environments where conventional boats struggled. But what made the DUKW truly revolutionary was not its technical specifications but its tactical implications. Amphibious warfare had always required establishing beachheads under fire, a bloody and time-consuming process. Landing craft had to beach themselves, drop ramps, and hope troops could get ashore before enemy fire became overwhelming. Supplies had to be laboriously transferred from ships to boats to beaches to vehicles, with each transfer point representing delay and vulnerability. The DUKW eliminated these bottlenecks. It could load at a ship, swim to shore, drive inland, deliver its cargo, and return, all without stopping or transferring loads. It required no special docking facilities, no port infrastructure, no complex logistics. It was mobile firepower and supply capacity that could go anywhere water met land. By September 1944, the U.S. Army's 542nd Amphibian Truck Company had been operating DUKWs in New Guinea for 3 months. They had supported coastal operations, delivered supplies to forward positions accessible only by water, and evacuated wounded from areas where helicopters could not land. The crews had become expert at coaxing maximum performance from their vehicles, learning tricks that no manual could teach. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Haskell, commanding the 542nd, had been studying the Wewak situation for weeks. Traditional assault plans called for infantry to cross in assault boats under covering fire, establish a beachhead, then engineers would construct bridges or ferry points for vehicles and heavy equipment. This approach would take days and cost hundreds of casualties against the prepared Japanese defenses. Haskell proposed something radically different. Use DUKWs to transport the first assault wave directly across the river at high speed, landing troops at unexpected points where the Japanese had not concentrated defenses. Follow immediately with more DUKWs carrying heavy weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Bypass the killing zones entirely by landing where the enemy thought landing was impossible. The plan was audacious but faced significant skepticism from infantry commanders. These officers had spent years learning assault boat tactics. The idea of riding into combat in trucks seemed absurd. Trucks did not belong in water. Even if these amphibious trucks worked as advertised, surely Japanese defenders would simply shoot them like they would any other boat. Haskell countered these objections with demonstrations. He had his Dukus race assault boats across measured courses, and the Dukus won every time. He had them approach defended positions in training exercises, and the speed combined with the ability to immediately drive inland rather than struggle up beaches proved tactically superior. Most convincingly, he pointed out that Dukus could mount machine guns and provide their own covering fire during the crossing, something assault boats could not do effectively. Permission was granted for a limited operational test. 2 infantry companies, approximately 400 men, would make the initial crossing in Dukus. If successful, the entire assault would follow this model. If it failed, conventional tactics would be employed, and the DUKW experiment would be shelved. The soldiers selected for the first wave underwent intensive training. They practiced boarding Dukus quickly, learned to brace themselves during water entry, and rehearsed immediate disembarkation upon reaching the far shore. They practiced on rivers similar to the Wewak, learning to trust that these ungainly-looking vehicles would not sink and could deliver them safely. The DUKW crews prepared their vehicles meticulously. Engines were tuned for maximum reliability. Hulls were inspected for any potential leaks. Weapons mounts were installed, typically .50 caliber machine guns that could provide suppressive fire during the crossing. Extra ammunition and medical supplies were secured in waterproof containers. Intelligence gathering intensified as the operation approached. Reconnaissance patrols mapped Japanese positions along the eastern riverbank, identifying strongpoints and weak spots. Aerial photographs were studied for any signs of obstacles in the river itself, submerged logs or wire that might disable a DUKW mid-crossing. Coast watchers, Australian commandos who had been operating behind Japanese lines for months, provided detailed reports on enemy patrol patterns and defensive preparations. What emerged from this intelligence was both encouraging and sobering. The Japanese defensive positions were indeed formidable, but they were oriented towards stopping a conventional boat assault. The strongpoints were concentrated at obvious landing beaches and ferry crossing points. Long stretches of riverbank, dismissed by Japanese planners as too steep or too overgrown for landing operations, were lightly defended or completely unguarded. These were precisely the areas Haskell intended to target. If Dukus could climb steep banks and push through vegetation, these supposedly impossible landing sites would become avenues of assault that Japanese defenders had never anticipated. The operation was scheduled for dawn on September 15. Darkness would cover the final approach to the river, but first light would provide enough visibility for navigation and targeting. Artillery preparation would begin 30 minutes before the crossing, targeting known Japanese positions but carefully avoiding the actual landing zones to maintain tactical surprise. On the night of September 14, the assault force moved into position. Infantry companies marched through jungle trails to assembly areas a mile back from the river. The Dukus, which had been carefully hidden under camouflage netting for weeks, were brought forward in single-file convoys, their engines muffled with special exhaust systems that reduced noise signature. Japanese listening posts heard the movement, of course. Some American radio chatter was deliberately left unsecured, discussing the massing of assault boats and preparation of ferry equipment. Japanese intelligence officers dutifully reported these preparations to their commanders, who ordered their troops to maximum alert and had artillery crews stand ready to engage expected boat crossings at dawn. What Japanese observers did not detect, could not have imagined detecting, were the 32 Dukus now positioned in concealed staging areas along the western riverbank. These vehicles represented a capability entirely outside Japanese military doctrine. Their intelligence manuals contained no references to amphibious trucks. Their defensive planning assumed all river crossings would employ boats, which had predictable capabilities and limitations. This intelligence gap was not the result of laziness or incompetence. The DUKW was genuinely new, its operational doctrine was still being written, and Japanese forces cut off in New Guinea had no way to receive updated intelligence even if it existed. They were preparing to fight the enemy they knew, using tactics proven against previous Allied assaults. They were about to discover that warfare had changed while they had been isolated in their river fortress, and the change was about to arrive at 6 knots, carrying fully armed infantry and mounting heavy machine guns, from directions they had assumed were safe. As dawn approached on September 15, Japanese sentries stared across the dark river, waiting for the assault boats they were certain would come. Behind them, their comrades manned artillery pieces and machine guns, confident in their positions and their plan. The river, their greatest ally, flowed swift and strong between the armies. In 30 minutes, that ally would become irrelevant, and the defensive line that had taken months to build would be outflanked by vehicles that refused to acknowledge the difference between land and water. The Japanese defenders would see something they had been taught was impossible, and by the time they understood what they were seeing, American troops would already be behind their positions, rolling inland in trucks that had just finished swimming across what was supposed to be an impassable river. The stage was set for a demonstration of technological surprise as complete as any in the Pacific War. The Japanese could not believe what was about to happen. But belief, as they would shortly discover, was entirely irrelevant to reality. The first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky pale gray when Lieutenant Colonel Haskell gave the signal. 32 DUKW engines rumbled to life in near-perfect synchronization, their drivers having practiced this moment dozens of times. The sound was muted by the jungle canopy and the rushing water of the Wewak River, but to the men aboard, it felt thunderous. Each vehicle carried between 18 and 22 soldiers from the 124th Infantry Regiment, men who had spent the previous night checking weapons, writing letters home they hoped would never be mailed, and trying not to think too hard about riding into combat in trucks that were supposed to swim. Private First Class James Morrison sat near the front of DUKW No. 7, his rifle clutched across his chest, watching the back of Corporal Eddie Chen's helmet bob slightly with the vehicle's idle vibration. Morrison had grown up in Kansas, about as far from ocean as a person could get in America, and the idea of a swimming truck still seemed like something from a science fiction magazine. Yet here he was, feeling the hole beneath him, knowing that in minutes this vehicle would drive into a river and keep going. The artillery preparation began right on schedule. American 105mm howitzers, positioned 3 miles back from the river, opened fire with a sound like continuous thunder. Shells screamed overhead, impacting Japanese positions with flashes of orange flame that briefly illuminated the far riverbank. The bombardment was carefully orchestrated, hitting known strongpoints while deliberately avoiding the actual landing zones the DUKWs would use. Japanese defenders, expecting this preparatory fire to precede a boat assault, rushed to their positions and prepared to engage what they assumed would be conventional landing craft emerging from the smoke and chaos. Haskell watched the artillery impacts through binoculars, counting down the seconds. The barrage would last exactly 12 minutes, long enough to keep Japanese heads down but not so long that they could fully recover and reposition before the assault arrived. At the 10-minute mark, he gave the order to move forward. The DUKWs lurched into motion, emerging from concealment and rumbling down narrow trails toward the riverbank. Japanese observation posts spotted the movement immediately. Reports crackled over field telephones to command bunkers. American vehicles approaching the river. Type unknown. Large number. Commanders issued immediate orders. Prepare to engage landing craft. All artillery redirect to embarkation points. Machine gunners stand ready. The response was textbook perfect, exactly what doctrine prescribed for repelling a river crossing. What those Japanese observers were reporting as vehicles approaching the river were actually vehicles about to enter the river. The distinction seemed trivial, but it would prove decisive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lead DUKW reached the water's edge traveling at 15 miles per hour. Without hesitation, without slowing, the vehicle plunged down the muddy bank and into the Wewak River. The impact sent spray 20 feet into the air. For one heart-stopping moment, the DUKW's nose dipped below the surface and soldiers gripped their rifles tighter, certain they were about to sink. Then the propeller engaged, the wheels found purchase in the river bottom, and the vehicle surged forward, now floating and driving simultaneously through water that came up to the tops of its wheels. Morrison felt his stomach lurch as DUKW number 7 followed the leader into the river. The transition from land to water was abrupt and unsettling. One second they were bouncing over jungle trail, the next they were plowing through brown river water with waves breaking over the bow. But the DUKW did not sink. It did not stall. It kept moving forward with determined mechanical purpose, its engine note changing slightly but never faltering. Behind them, 30 more dukus entered the water in rapid succession. The formation spread out automatically, drivers heading for their assigned landing zones at various points along a 3-mile stretch of riverbank. From above, it would have looked like a fleet of strange hybrid vehicles, part boat and part truck, churning across the river at speeds no conventional assault boat could match. On the eastern bank, Japanese defenders finally got clear looks at what was approaching. The initial response was confusion. These were not boats. They had wheels. They looked like trucks, but trucks could not drive through water. Some observers thought they were seeing amphibious tanks, but the vehicles were too large and moved wrong. Reports to command bunkers became increasingly frantic and contradictory. Strange vehicles crossing the river. Type unknown. Moving very fast. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, commanding a machine gun position overlooking what had been considered an impossible landing site due to its steep bank, stared at the approaching dukus with genuine bewilderment. In 3 years of combat across the Pacific, he had seen American equipment ranging from primitive to impressive, but this was entirely outside his experience. The vehicles were definitely coming toward his position, definitely moving through water that should have stopped any truck, and definitely approaching fast enough that he needed to make a decision. He made the correct tactical decision. He opened fire. The Type 92 heavy machine gun in his bunker began chattering, sending 7.7mm rounds toward the nearest DUKW at a rate of 450 rounds per minute. Other Japanese positions along the riverbank joined in, tracers arcing across the water like angry hornets. This was the moment of maximum danger for the assault force. The dukus were in open water, exposed, with nowhere to take cover. If Japanese fire proved accurate enough, if enough vehicles were disabled or sunk, the entire operation could still fail catastrophically. But the dukus had advantages assault boats lacked. Their metal hulls, while not armored, were far more resistant to small arms fire than the wooden or canvas sides of conventional boats. Their speed, 6 knots sustained, meant they crossed the beaten zone where enemy fire was most concentrated in far less time than slower craft. Most importantly, they could shoot back. Every DUKW mounted at least one heavy machine gun, and most carried 2. As Japanese fire intensified, American gunners returned fire with devastating effect. The .50 caliber machine guns had far greater range and hitting power than Japanese weapons. DUKW gunners could see Japanese muzzle flashes and target them immediately, pouring suppressive fire into enemy positions while the vehicles continued their relentless advance. Private First Class Angela Rodriguez, manning the .50 caliber on DUKW number 12, had never fired at a human target before this morning. She had trained extensively, had qualified expert with the weapon, but shooting at pop-up targets on a Kansas firing range was entirely different from this. She could see the Japanese bunker quite clearly now, could see tracers coming from its firing slit, could imagine the men inside frantically feeding ammunition belts and adjusting their aim. She pressed her thumbs down on the butterfly trigger and felt the .50 caliber roar to life. The recoil was manageable but insistent, the weapon bucking steadily as it sent thumb-sized bullets downrange at 2,900 feet per second. She walked her fire across the bunker's face, watching rounds spark off logs and kick up dirt. The Japanese return fire slackened, then stopped. She could not know if she had killed anyone, wounded anyone, or merely forced them to take cover, and there was no time to think about it. Another position was firing from farther down the bank, and she traversed her weapon toward it. The crossing took 4 minutes. To the soldiers aboard the dukus, it felt like hours. To the Japanese defenders, it seemed impossibly fast. One moment the strange vehicles were in mid-river, the next they were grinding up the eastern bank, wheels churning mud and vegetation, still moving at combat speed. DUKW No. 1, carrying Captain Thomas Brennan and the lead infantry squad, hit the bank at a spot where Japanese planners had placed nothing more than a single two-man observation post. The DUKW's six-wheel drive and adjustable tire pressure system let it climb the steep incline without hesitation. The observation post occupants, armed only with rifles, fired a few hasty shots before fleeing inland. Within seconds, Captain Brennan's squad was dismounting, forming a perimeter, and securing the immediate landing zone. DUKW No. 7, carrying Private Morrison and his squad, landed 50 yards to the south. Morrison jumped from the vehicle before it fully stopped, his training overriding his fear. His boots hit solid ground. He went to one knee, rifle up, scanning for targets. The riverbank here was thick with conai grass taller than a man, providing concealment but limiting visibility to a few yards. He could hear other squads landing nearby, hear sergeants shouting orders, hear the continued chatter of machine guns as DUKWs still in the river engaged Japanese positions. What Morrison did not hear was massive return fire. There were Japanese defenders nearby, certainly, and there would be fighting, absolutely. But the overwhelming hail of fire that doctrine said should meet any river crossing, the interlocking fields of fire that should have turned the landing zones into killing grounds, did not materialize. The Japanese defensive plan, elegant and deadly when facing conventional boat assaults at predictable points, had been rendered largely irrelevant by vehicles landing at multiple points simultaneously, many at locations deemed too difficult for any landing. Within 10 minutes of the first DUKW entering the water, all 32 vehicles had successfully crossed and landed their infantry. Not a single DUKW had been sunk. 3 had taken damage from Japanese fire, mostly punctured tires and minor hull breaches, but all remained mobile. More importantly, all had deposited their troops on the eastern bank and were already returning to the western shore for second loads. Japanese commanders receiving reports from the riverbank struggled to comprehend what was happening. The Americans had crossed in trucks. The trucks had driven through the river. The trucks were now driving inland. Multiple crossing points had been established simultaneously. The carefully prepared defensive positions were being bypassed or attacked from unexpected angles. Nothing in Japanese tactical doctrine addressed this situation because the situation had been deemed impossible. Colonel Hiroshi Takahashi, commanding the Wewak River defensive sector, made a decision that demonstrated both his tactical acumen and the depth of the problem he faced. He ordered a general counterattack. Rather than trying to contain multiple breaches in his defensive line, he would mass his mobile reserves and attempt to drive the Americans back into the river before they could consolidate their positions. It was a bold decision, perhaps the only decision that offered any chance of success. It was also exactly the wrong decision, because Colonel Takahashi did not understand that the vehicles carrying American troops across the river were still operating, still moving, and were about to deliver something Japanese defenders were completely unprepared to face so quickly. The second wave of DUKWs, loaded with heavy weapons and ammunition, began crossing even before the first wave had completely unloaded. These vehicles carried .30 caliber machine guns, 60 mm mortars, bazookas, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They also carried combat engineers with demolitions, medical personnel with supplies, and radio operators with communications equipment. Everything an infantry force needed to sustain combat operations was swimming across the Wewak River at 6 knots. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a combat engineer riding in DUKW No. 19, carried 40 pounds of C2 plastic explosive in his pack and a demolition kit that could blow through bunker walls or collapse tunnels. In conventional operations, engineers like O'Brien would not arrive at a beachhead until hours or even days after the initial assault, once the beach was secured and ferry operations established. But here he was, crossing the river in the second wave, perhaps 20 minutes after the first troops landed. The DUKWs carrying heavy weapons landed and immediately drove inland to designated support positions. Mortar crews dismounted and had their weapons in action within minutes. Machine gun teams set up interlocking fields of fire. The infantry companies that had landed in the first wave suddenly had organic fire support, something that should not have been possible this early in an assault operation. When Colonel Takahashi's counterattack force, approximately 300 soldiers supported by light tanks, emerged from the jungle moving toward the landing zones, they ran directly into a kill zone that should not have existed yet. American infantry, already well positioned with clear fields of fire, opened up with rifles and automatic weapons. Machine gun teams, emplaced and ready, added devastating crossfire. Mortar crews, having already registered their weapons, dropped high explosive rounds with deadly accuracy. The Japanese attack stalled within minutes. The light tanks, Type 95 Hago models with thin armor and 37mm guns, were engaged by bazookas teams who had crossed in the second DUKW wave. The first tank exploded when a rocket penetrated its turret ring. The second threw a track trying to maneuver away from incoming fire. The third reversed back into the jungle trailing smoke. Japanese infantry, caught in open ground without adequate fire support, took horrific casualties. Those who reached American positions found themselves fighting troops who were not exhausted from a difficult river crossing, not low on ammunition, not isolated from support. They were fresh, well supplied, and supported by weapons that conventional doctrine said should not arrive for hours. The counterattack collapsed. Survivors retreated into the jungle, leaving behind more than 80 dead and wounded. American casualties in repelling the attack totaled 3 killed and 11 wounded. The lopsided nature of this engagement drove home to every Japanese soldier who witnessed it that something fundamental had changed in how battles were fought. Meanwhile, the Dukus continued their relentless shuttle operations. Third-wave vehicles carried additional ammunition and supplies. Fourth-wave vehicles brought forward observers for artillery support and more medical personnel. By 90 minutes after the initial crossing, more than 800 American troops were on the eastern bank, along with tons of supplies, all delivered by vehicles that had simply driven across what Japanese planners had considered an impassable obstacle. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. The Wewak River, their primary defensive feature, had been negated. The carefully prepared positions that covered conventional crossing points were now behind American lines or irrelevant. The slow, vulnerable boat crossings they had trained to repel had never materialized. Instead, the Americans had arrived in vehicles that made the river itself meaningless. Japanese troops began abandoning their riverbank positions without orders. Some fell back to secondary defensive lines inland. Others, isolated and demoralized, simply melted into the jungle. The defensive coherence that had existed at dawn was shattered by mid-morning, not through overwhelming American force, but through the introduction of a capability that invalidated defensive assumptions. By noon on September 15, American forces held a continuous 4-mile stretch of the eastern riverbank. The DUKW companies had made more than 120 crossings, delivering over 1,500 troops and 75 tons of supplies. Not a single vehicle had been lost to enemy action. Mechanical breakdowns had disabled 2 Dukus, but even these had been towed back across the river by other vehicles for repair. The exploitation phase began immediately. Rather than consolidating and waiting for conventional bridge or ferry construction, American commanders pushed inland using the same Dukus that had made the assault crossing. Entire infantry companies, mounted in Dukus, drove along jungle trails toward Japanese rear areas. The vehicles that had been boats an hour ago were now trucks again, carrying troops and supplies at speeds foot infantry could never match. Japanese forces attempting to form new defensive lines found American troops already behind them, delivered by vehicles whose very existence they still struggled to comprehend. Radio intercepts captured by American intelligence units revealed the confusion. One Japanese officer reported being attacked by American tanks that had somehow crossed the river without using bridges. Another insisted the Americans had deployed hundreds of boats disguised as trucks. A third, closer to the truth but still not quite grasping the reality, reported that the Americans possessed trucks that could float. By nightfall on September 15, the entire Japanese defensive structure in the Wewak region was collapsing. What should have been a protracted battle to force a river crossing had been accomplished in a single morning. What should have required weeks of subsequent operations to exploit the crossing was happening in hours. The DUKWs, methodically shuttling back and forth, had delivered the combat power to shatter a defensive position that Japanese commanders had considered nearly impregnable. Private Morrison, digging a foxhole for the night 3 miles inland from where he had landed that morning, reflected on the surreal nature of the day. He had ridden into combat in a truck that swam, had fought a brief but intense firefight, had watched that same truck drive inland and deliver supplies, and was now preparing for night defense deeper into Japanese territory than any planner had predicted reaching on the first day. The DUKW that had carried him across the river was already making another supply run, its crew unconcerned about darkness or enemy fire, simply executing their mission with the same matter-of-fact efficiency they had shown all day. The Japanese defenders, scattered and demoralized, prepared for what they knew would be the continuation of American pressure. They had learned today that the rules had changed, that obstacles they had relied upon could be simply driven through, that defensive lines carefully prepared over months could be outflanked in minutes. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, and they had no answer to it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.